my colleagues and I, who are on the Speaker's Trade Working Group, are dedicated to doing, to be negotiating these changes. As Democrats, we want an agreement that ends the devastating outsourcing that NAFTA has caused. However, the administration's current proposal lacks the strong, enforceable labor and environmental standards necessary to ensure that workers are paid a fair wage and that communities are not polluted in secret or into oblivion. To get to that agreement that works for working people, we need an agreement that we can support. We need those provisions changed, and they need to be changed in the text of the agreement. Not in the side agreement, not in implementing language, but in the text of the agreement, so that they have the full force of the law. Working people deserve to have their needs enshrined in writing with the strongest ink that there is. What the administration did not put into writing is almost alarming as what they did. The agreement that the president signed in November locks in monopoly rights for Big Pharma. It is a gift to the pharmaceutical industry, in particular for the companies that produce biologics. These are some of the most expensive prescription drugs on the market, which are often used to treat cancer or chronic illnesses. Our view is that the pharma provision has no business being in a trade agreement, and that we want it out, and that it will prevent the Congress from taking action to lower the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs, which is the very thing the voters sent us here to do. We have been told that it doesn't change U.S. law and that they can get around it. Well, we have had the best example with the Farm Bill and country of origin labeling. When we lost that fight at the WTO, and when Canada and Mexico said that they were going to impose high tariffs on us, what did this body do? In a nanosecond, we reversed country of origin labeling, which was going to be to the benefit of the American people and the safety of their food. We have been clear about our priorities and what they are to ensure that the agreement works for working people. 1, secure labor and environmental standards to stop companies from outsourcing U.S. jobs. 2, to include an enforcement mechanism in the text of the agreement that will ensure that we have the tools to better identify where labor violations are occurring. We also want to be able to hold Mexico to its commitment to labor law reform. We want to preserve patient access to life-saving generic medications and block harmful pharma-drafted provisions. By the way, Canada didn't ask for these provisions. Mexico didn't ask for these provisions. The only folks who did was the pharmaceutical industry. And 4, we want to ensure that improved environmental standards are strengthened and subject to swift and certain enforcement to address the devastating impact on climate change. We have been consistent over these many, many months. We will remain so. What the calendar looks like is not as important as what the end result looks like for working people. Because if the first NAFTA taught us anything, is a bad deal today, is a bad deal tomorrow, is a bad deal yesterday. So to conclude, let me just say, Democrats are listening to the American people, including 390,000 petition signers. We will continue to work in good faith to make the improvements that this agreement needs to ensure it ends the devastating damage that NAFTA has caused, and it becomes a model for where we need to go in the future for our trade agreements. And now it really gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka. Rich has been a champion of America's working people for his entire life. He hails originally from a small coal mining community of southwest Pennsylvania, and he worked in the Pennsylvania mines like his father and his father before him. That commitment to good, honest, hard work, as well as his steadfast solidarity with working people of his community, has infused his leadership as president of the AFL-CIO. His leadership, advocacy, starts at the kitchen table and it spans the world. He envisions an economy that works for all working families, an economy of rising wages, equal pay, respect at work, safe jobs, and the freedom to form or to join unions and bargain collectively. And he knows what it takes to get us there. I don't know where we would be without President Trumka. He has rallied international labor support for workers struggling for justice, and he has pressed to end unfair trade practices to restore U.S. manufacturing strength. He is tireless, an advocate, and the best leader that you can have. And we're so glad to have you here today, and it's an honor to introduce you, President Trumka.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Rosa, for that overly generous introduction, but more importantly, for being such a friend and a champion of working people, particularly on this issue. And I'm here on behalf of the 55 unions and 12.5 members of the AFL-CIO to say no vote on the new NAFTA until it's fixed. I spent last week holding roundtables and town halls at Ground Zero for our failed trade policy. I was in Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Akron, Cleveland, Toledo, and Detroit. And the workers in these towns sent me back with a very, very clear message to deliver. The new NAFTA is not good enough yet. People are hurting, they're searching for answers, and they refuse to support another trade agreement that doesn't account for their needs. We're delivering hundreds of thousands of petitions to congressional offices today. They're from faith leaders, labor unions, environmental organizations, and consumer groups, and we're all united. No vote on a new NAFTA until it's worthy of the American people. You know, as I traveled through the Midwest last week, I couldn't help but think about 1994. We warned Congress, we warned President Clinton, we knew what would happen. 25 years later, we simply will not allow history to repeat itself. Do we want to replace NAFTA? Oh, you bet we do. But doing it right is more important than doing it fast. So there should be no vote until Mexico can prove that it has the infrastructure and the resources to eliminate nearly 1 million protectionist contracts and raise wages and standards through real unions. There should be no vote until the new NAFTA has a dispute settlement process that can't be blocked by one of the parties. And there should be no vote until workers have a way to enforce this agreement, including the right to stop goods at the border that were produced in violation of the labor chapter. See, working people are watching. We're ready to turn the page on NAFTA. We're ready to end the era of outsourcing. So it's time for negotiators to go back to the table and hammer out an agreement that is good for working people. Bring us that deal, and I promise you, we'll support it. But until then, no vote until NAFTA is fixed. Now, join me in welcoming a good friend of working people and a good friend of mine, Congressman Chuy Garcia. Chuy.
Thank you. Thank you, President Trump. I just want to say that There was no P at the end of the first syllable. I want to begin my remarks by saying that a rising tide of prosperity in North America should help lift the working and living conditions of people everywhere in Canada, the U.S., Mexico, Central and South America. And after the North American Free Trade Agreement, we saw middle-class jobs in the U.S. become sweatshop jobs in Mexico. This is why we gather here today. Then we saw dirtier air and water in Mexico, flat wages here in the U.S., and lower wages throughout Mexico's manufacturing sector. If the current draft of the USMCA is an effort to address these glaring problems, it is still a work in progress. And we're here to finish that process. The draft deal is a no-go without significant changes. Stronger language to bring down prescription drug monopolies and costs. We should not extend them into Mexico. Better labor standards and enforcement, commonsensical. Stronger environmental standards. Also, the Trump administration must agree to these changes or this deal is a no-go. The USMCA prompted some positive reforms to Mexico's labor laws. We welcome that. But just this week, Mexico's employer-dominated unions issued a legal challenge that cast the future of those reforms in doubt. Unless the USMCA's labor standards are strengthened, wage suppression and exploitation in all three countries will continue. Under NAFTA, corporations have enormous power to challenge state environmental and health protections. Thankfully, the USMCA pares back this power in a number of areas, but preserves it for oil and gas firms doing business with Mexico. Even more concerning, the agreement maintains a monopoly drug prices for important medicines like insulin. And I represent one of the districts in this country that has one of the higher levels of people with diabetes. We don't want this problem to extend into our neighbor to the south. Under the USMCA, drugs like insulin are likely to continue soaring, and we know drug prices in Mexico are guaranteed to go up. The Trump administration must work with House Democrats to strengthen labor enforcement standards, strip exemptions for oil and gas firms, and end monopoly prices for prescription drugs. Without these changes and cooperation with House Democrats, USMCA is an absolutely no-go deal. Let's fix it. Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce a longtime champion of working people in Michigan and all over our country, and for workers the world over, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, Rosa DeLauro, who's all of our leaders. And thank you, President Trumka. Okay, I'm going to be short, because I am short. But I want to really just crystallize this deal. I'm a car girl, and I come from a car state. I don't call this anything fancy. I call what we have in front of us NAFTA 2.0. I have empty plants. McLeod Steel has sat on my riverfront in the downrivers for 25 years empty. Willow Run, the arsenal of democracy, sits there empty, and lots of plants in between. And there's one reason, NAFTA 1.0. It shipped jobs to Mexico. I want those jobs to come home. I need my workers beg for NAFTA 2.0. President Trumka came to my district. I was proud that he went there. But my workers also say to me, don't give us the shaft. Right, General Motors, this wasn't 20-some years ago when we passed the first NAFTA. General Motors last August announced they were putting a Blazer plant in Mexico. And you know what they're paying those workers? friends, real terms, only announced it last August, they're paying $1.50 an hour. That is not leveling the playing field. Our workers need to compete on a level playing field. We need all workers to do well, and that is what we're trying to do. And there is no one who will race to the front of a line to get my workers a better deal. But ramming a bill through just to say, let's make a deal that doesn't save jobs, doesn't help workers, doesn't level the playing field, screws the American worker, it doesn't help them. So we need to get together, we need to make these changes that everybody's talking about, and you need to worry when they say, oh, Mexico passed, we're going to have enforceable labor standards. Tell me how enforceable they are when 93 people are 96, whatever that number is, are challenging it. We need enforceable labor standards, and we need to pay our workers a fair deal, and we need to pay Mexican workers a fair deal and level the playing field. That's when we vote for NAFTA 2.0. And now I'm going to introduce my colleague, Andy Levin, who always tries to keep me calm, but he's more intense than I am on this subject. Welcome, Andy Levin.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thanks for being here. President Trumka. Thanks, Rosa DeLauro, for your incredible leadership on this. I'm here to say that NAFTA was a disaster. It was a horrible deal for American workers and Mexican workers, and we're not about to rush to replace it with something that just perpetuates the fundamental problem, which is that productivity in Mexico has been rising and rising, as it has in the United States, but wages there have actually gone down in real terms, also driving wages in the US and Canada down in real terms. It has been a disaster for the working people of our country, and especially for Debbie and my state of Michigan. The new sweetheart deal that President Trump negotiated for the oil and gas industry cannot stand as part of this, and especially the sweetheart deal he made with Big Pharma cannot stand. As you've heard, nobody in Mexico, nobody in Canada asked for these long protections for biologics, and I just want to testify personally about this for a minute. I'm the dad of 2 kids with Crohn's disease. I have literally received a bill for Remicade in my house for 1 infusion that a kid away at college had for $23,000. No family can pay that. My kids have been on Remicade, Humira, Entyvio, all these biologics. We cannot hand away to Big Pharma the ability to have monopolies for so long when we need to be going in the other direction and increasing competition for drugs in our country and in Mexico and Canada. So Mr. Trump really has to tackle the central flaw of what he called the worst trade deal ever. And I just want to get a little bit specific about this. Before NAFTA, we didn't have a trade deficit with Mexico. And ever since NAFTA, we've run a stubborn $100 billion deficit with Mexico, year in and year out. And by 2013, NAFTA had displaced 852,000 U.S. jobs, mostly in the manufacturing sector. So how bad is that for us right now in terms of the auto industry? U.S. auto imports from Mexico to the U.S. doubled between 2011 and 2018. 4/5 of the cars made in Mexico are not sold in Mexico. They're not shipped south to Central America or South America. 4/5 of the cars made in Mexico, including those Chevy Blazers that Debbie talked about, are exported to the United States. So we cannot stand for this. We've got to strengthen enforcement mechanisms. I'm glad that President Trumka is talking about hot goods provisions, so we keep Mexican goods made in violation of whatever the new provisions are out of our country. we are very concerned about reality. I did a little check on this, and last year the National Labor Relations Board ran about 1,200 elections in our whole country. In our whole country. They're talking about overseeing the redoing of 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 protection agreements in Mexico in 4 years with way less resources, way less infrastructure. We need to talk about reality, folks, and until we see enforcement provisions that will really allow Mexican workers the freedom to form unions and bargain collectively and raise their standard of living, we are not going to pass any new NAFTA. Thank you very much. And I want to introduce one of our major leaders in this fight for many years, a real champion for workers around the world, Representative Jan Schakowsky of Illinois. You will introduce, the list is here, so Roe and Brendan.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. I'm Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky from the 9th Congressional District of Illinois. You see in front of you hundreds of thousands of petitions. I want to thank President Trumka and union members for collecting those, but let me be clear, this pile could go up to the top of the trees of the people who are concerned about the trade deal, about workers and their rights, about the environment, and about the cost of pharmaceuticals, which the American people are telling us is one of the major problems that they are facing today, and that this new NAFTA would make even worse. Why should American workers be so concerned about the workers in Mexico? Because as long as their wages are suppressed, as long as their rights are suppressed, we are going to see this wave of outsourcing continue. That's why we have to have greater parity. That's why we have to stand with the Mexican workers to be able to organize and to be able to get their wages right. I want to also talk about the pharmaceutical piece of this. As I said, the American people, and you heard from Andy Levin talking about a $23,000 bill he got. And frankly, if you watch television, those are the drugs that are advertised all the time, the new category of biologics. No one, as a party to this agreement, other than the United States of America, not Canada, not Mexico, is asking for a provision in here that would create a 10-year patent exclusivity for the biologics. The only interest that wants this is big pharma, so that they can increase their profits and continue to gouge people and possibly likely raise prices all over the hemisphere, raise it in Mexico, raise them in Canada. And so we are meeting today with the trade director, Mr. Lighthizer, trade ambassador, to ask him to change that. We can do this. We can make these changes. And I want to call out also Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. We have been meeting on a weekly basis in her office talking about these changes. These are not hard. These are not hard. We could do that. We could do the labor changes. We could do the enforcement changes. We could do the environmental changes. We could do the pharmaceuticals. The American people are asking for this on their behalf. We have to do it. Thank you very much. Yes. And now let me introduce Congressman Ro Khanna of California. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Schakowsky. I want to echo your praise for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, Rosa has been doing this for a year, not for 6 months or 3 weeks, every week organizing the caucus when it wasn't popular. So thank you for what you've done. And President Richard Trumka, who understands and stands up for working families probably more than anyone in this country. I'm going to be very brief and just touch on one aspect of why this is a terrible agreement. It's basically a handout to pharmaceuticals. Let me be very specific. Right now, biologics have a 5-year patent in Mexico. They have an 8-year patent in Canada. What does this do? This locks us in to 10 years. Now, Jan Schakowsky has a bill that many people are on that would lower the biologic patent to 5 years. If this passes, Jan Schakowsky will never be able to get her bill off the floor. And why does it matter to real people? Look at what was in the news with Gilead and Truvada, which is a life-saving drug for HIV. That was discovered in 2004. Well, guess what? Gilead has a better drug, Descoins, which they have been sitting on. They have been sitting on for almost 10 years. And they didn't bring it to the market because they didn't want their patent to get jeopardized. That is what this agreement would do. It would deprive people of life-saving drugs. It is nothing more than to hand out the pharmaceuticals, and it makes no political sense when the one consensus in this country is everyone is frustrated with the abuse of the pharmaceutical companies. Thank you.
Congressman Don Norcross from New Jersey. The great
Good to be here. This is where I'm more comfortable. Give me a pair of jeans. Just want to say to Rich Trumka, who 25 years ago, we both had different jobs, but we were working on the same thing, and that's making sure that we take care of the working men and women of this country. So go back to 1992-3 when NAFTA started coming up, and we were promised how good this would be for the United States, that we're going to get more jobs, better paying jobs. Well, it was in some ways good for some people in the United States if you owned a company. But if you were the worker, you got screwed. You got screwed royally. In my district alone, almost 20,000 manufacturing jobs went south and never came back. That's the reality of what happened during NAFTA. So you have to put it in that context so you understand what we're going through now on this agreement. We want to get a better deal than NAFTA. We want to make sure that men and women have the level playing field, no matter what country they're in. But we were promised something in 1994, and you know what happened to us. The idea of trust me again and somehow it's going to be different, this isn't going to do it. That's why the enforcement mechanism, no matter how good the language is in the agreement, is everything. For those of you who drive cars out 95, 55 miles an hour, imagine no policeman. And I'm sure everybody would do 55, right? That's what's happening here and why it is just so critically important. The devil is really in the details. President Trumka knows the labor enforcements need to be there for us to get that one step closer. When the UAW confirms we're doing enough to save U.S. auto manufacturing, then we'll be one step closer. Because you know when President Trump says something, you have no idea what that means. But it's probably not good for workers. So we continue to hope, negotiate to make sure that if we have an agreement, it's better for U.S. workers, not just for that 1% who owns them. Thank you. Lori Wallach. There you are.
I want to thank Congresswoman DeLauro for her inspiring leadership, and it's an honor to be here with President Trumka and with a wonderful set of members of Congress and labor partners who are fighting for working people and healthy communities every day. Today, activists are delivering hundreds of thousands of petition signatures demanding no vote on NAFTA 2.0 until it's fixed. This is part of a day of action, but it follows on a year and a half of activists across the country meeting with their members of Congress, educating their neighbors, and fighting for the NAFTA replacement we desperately need. NAFTA's damage continues weekly to people across North America. These petitions demand that the new pharmaceutical monopoly protections added to the new agreement are removed so as to not lock in the policies in the United States that keep drug prices unreasonably high and export those bad policies to Mexico and Canada. These petitions demand stronger labor and environmental standards and their swift and certain enforcement to stop the outsourcing of jobs and pollution in a race to the bottom that NAFTA set off 25 years ago. In Mexico today, wages are lower than before NAFTA and 40% lower than manufacturing wages in China. Immoral, impossible to compete with. We can change that. The good news is the administration and a team of Democrats are meeting to try and make the fixes. The good news is some improvements were made in the original renegotiations. But make no mistake, a revised NAFTA will only get through Congress if key fixes are made, because the deal that Trump signed last year would not stop the outsourcing and would lock in high medicine prices. That opponents of past trade agreements are talking about fixing NAFTA 2.0 versus killing it shows there is a road to passage. The last 4 trade agreements that passed had to have their text changed after they were signed. But expect an ugly train wreck if the administration rushes to try and pass NAFTA 2.0 as is. As Speaker Pelosi has repeatedly said, this substance will set the timeline. So, if the White House is in a hurry to move quickly, all they need to do is to agree to the important changes that the team of Democratic Congresspeople, the unions, public citizens, and our other friends have been demanding, and we'll have a deal that works for working people and the environment right away. Thank you very much. And I'd like to introduce Hassan Solomon, who's the legislative director of the Machinists Union, a stalwart fighter for workers' rights who has been one of the fiercest activists for fair trade.
Good afternoon. As Lori stated, my name is Hassan Solomon. I'm privileged and honored to be the National Legislative Director for the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, the largest aerospace and defense union in North America, proudly representing over 500,000 active and retired members in Canada and in the United States. We believe that NAFTA 2.0 does absolutely nothing to stop U.S. companies from moving our work to Mexico, to take advantage of Mexican workers who do not enjoy fundamental human rights. The labor standards in NAFTA 2.0 are extremely weak and lack any real enforcement. We strongly believe that this flawed trade agreement must explicitly reference ILO conferences and standards. Labor violations must include human rights violations like murder, even if they are not sustained or reoccurring, as currently required by the text. Now, I know we live in the United States of amnesia, and that's why I'm here to remind you about the 40,000 machinist union workers in the aerospace industry that have lost their jobs because of NAFTA. 300 aerospace companies are now in Mexico doing our jobs, doing our work. Let's not repeat this history. Let's get NAFTA 2.0 fixed, and let's get it fixed now. There's absolutely no reason to rush this agreement through Congress. Now, I want to be crystal clear. This message is for any candidate running for president, any candidate that's running for Congress. If you support NAFTA 2.0 without the fixes that we demand today, do not call the Machinist Union for an endorsement. Don't call us for a contribution or political support. You need to call Mexico, where this agreement will continue to outsource our jobs. Thank you.
Well done. I want to just say a thank you to, first of all, to the group standing behind with all of you. My God, we would not be here without you today. You were with us when we were dealing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. You've been here now. You are the wind beneath our wings. You make this happen, and we are so, so grateful. To all of my colleagues who have come out, you can sense the energy, the passion on this issue, because deep within all of us is a sense that working men and women in this country have been shortchanged. They've been hurt. They lost their jobs, and they're not able to take care of their families. And in our partnership with the labor unions, with President Trumka, and with the machinists and the other labor organizations, this has been one united front, day in and day out. Though there are those who would try to pull us apart, make us disagree with one another, but at the source of our agreement is wanting a trade agreement that at the center of it is the benefits for working men and women in the United States of America and our fellow workers in Mexico. And we do not want to bankrupt people with the high cost of prescription drugs. We're going to get there. I guess on this receptacle here it says, "Farmer rigged it." You bet the Congress is going to fix it. Otherwise, there is no agreement. Thank you, and happy to answer questions. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Brian Bradley from American Shipper. What are some specific things that the Mexican government can do in the near term? It's going to take a while to redo all this protection contracts that would show you that they're serious about this implementation that would allow a vote to be set up.
First of all, they can show us that they are about to or in the process of building an infrastructure. Here's what they've promised to do in this agreement. They've promised to create a new court system. They've promised to create a new Department of Labor. They've promised to train all of those people. And they have promised to do away with a minimum of 700,000 protectionist contracts. That means they have to do 175,000 a year to get it done. We need to see that they have the infrastructure and the resources available to enforce the law in Mexico. Because if Mexican wages aren't allowed to rise, then this agreement will continue to suck jobs out of the United States.
I would also add, President Trumka, that they need to get to those 96.
There are 96 constitutional challenges to the new law that was just passed. Now, we have to see some clarity that this bill isn't declared unconstitutional in Mexico, because if it is, then the law becomes unenforceable, and then the trade agreement becomes unenforceable. And if that happens, we're back to NAFTA 1, where we have an artificially a model that keeps wages artificially low. That's not been good for the Mexican worker. It's not been good for the American or Canadian worker, and we're not going to agree to that. Many of the changes we're talking about cannot be done in the implementing language. They must be amendments to the existing text.
That has been stipulated from the outset. The USTR has understood that we need to look at these areas in terms of the underlying agreement. The implementing language or side deals are not sufficient, and they will be rejected. Yes.
Hi, Mara Lee, International Trade Today. My question is for Congresswoman DeLauro and Congresswoman Schakowsky. The price act that was just introduced is talking about a 5-year patent. The previous introduction was at 7 years. Why drop it down to 5 years now? And Congresswoman DeLauro, you're on the working group. Is the price act where you're starting with Lighthizer and changing the biologics?
I am going to, since the originator of the Price Act was Congresswoman Schakowsky, let me ask her to respond.
We believe, because of the incredible need now to make pharmaceuticals more available and more affordable for the American people, that 5-year patent exclusivity is enough. And by the way, we also have to deal with what is called evergreening, where these companies change one little thing about the drug that they've offered and ask for an additional 10 years, 12 years of patent exclusivity. We are seeing what the President of the United States has in the past called something like a ripoff. And so we think that 5 years is absolutely sufficient for the biologics.
Keep in mind that 2% of the drugs, these biologics, are responsible for 60% of the cost, of the overall cost. Think about it. It puts it into perspective. No other questions? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Rich, thanks. Scott, guys. Pat, Caroline.
Sorry. Congresswoman, I was wondering if you know what time the meeting with Lighthizer today is for the working group.
It's like 4 or 5.
4 or 5. And is it focused on drug pricing, or is it
We
everything?
want to start there. We think that may be the easiest. And as Lori was saying, we think it should just be